Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the IPR podcast. My name is Paavi, and I will be your host for today. We also have with us Mr. Srikanth Viswanathan. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Janaagraha, Center for Citizenship and Democracy. The nonprofit works with citizens and governments to better the quality of life across Indian cities and towns. So I'm going to jump right into the podcast because we have limited time. Thank you so much, Srikanth, for doing this with us.
Happy to be here.
So we know that urbanization is going to become a policy focus, right? India is rapidly urbanizing, it's youthful, people are migrating to cities and towns for new jobs, new opportunities. So what, according to you, are the biggest challenges when it comes to urbanization in India?
So urbanization is both a challenge and an opportunity. So we'll need to frame this as a challenge if we don't do the right things, but an opportunity if we respond to this with agility, with maturity, and with farsightedness. Obviously, as citizens in a city, we all experience these challenges on a day-to-day basis in terms of housing, water supply, power, sanitation, traffic, transport, etc., safety, and so on. But since you're asking me for one aspect of it, I would say the biggest challenge is for India to recognize the city as a unit of governance and a unit of the economy. So I'd say we'll have to align our thinking, align our response to urbanization, beginning with the recognition of the place called a city as a unit of governance and of economy.
Right. Do you think as of now, we don't do that? And does the 74th Amendment, has it been taken seriously in terms of providing autonomy to cities?
So as of now, we don't recognize the city as a unit of governance. And what do I mean by unit of governance, right? The country is a unit of governance.
Right.
The state is a unit of governance, right? You could say to some extent, even the district is a unit of governance, though the district does not have an elected wing in the urban side of things. But in the city, the mayor and the council, which are supposed to be the elected house of the people of the city,
right,
don't handle most aspects of governance of the city, right? Whether it is housing, or it is economic growth of the city, or it is jobs, or it is migrant welfare, or it be in many cases water supply even, or transport, etc. These are handled by different agencies of the state government or state departments themselves, like in the case of police, for example.
right.
Therefore, the city is not recognized as a unit of governance presently. What was the second part of your question again? The 74th Amendment. Yes. So the 74th Amendment, I'd say it certainly hasn't met its intended purpose completely. It has met its intended purpose partially in terms of having an elected council for the city. But by and large, I'd say the 74th Amendment hasn't met its intended purpose. And that has impacted the way India has both tried to surmount the challenges of urbanization in terms of quality of life and also leverage the opportunities that accompany it.
And that made a lot of sense. I think that gives us a nice overview to the conversation. Now, we also know that there's no national definition that sort of explains what or who is the urban poor population, right? Different states have different definition that also adds to migrant crisis in more ways than one. Do you think there should be a national definition? Is there a need to have a national definition?
It's a hard question.
Okay.
I'll confess by saying that we are a practitioner organization. We are not an academic or a research organization. So in that sense, I do not have full subject matter expertise to respond to this question. But we do have a point of view on how we should look at this question. So my response is from that perspective. So my top of the head response is, it doesn't look realistic, plausible, or even desirable for us to have one national definition, right? We are a federal country. We have a fairly heterogeneous, heterogeneous group of states. Therefore, I would basically posit that it is all right for different states to have their own definitions of urban and urbanization. But I would say probably there is a need for consensus at a national level on how will we define urban, which essentially means it's not a definition, but it is, maybe you need an expert committee that, that looks at it every 10 years, aligned to the census, or you need a broad set of principles to be laid out at the national level, which then can be adapted for state variations, etc. So I do believe the states, it's fine for the states to actually take a view on this, but it has to be done more scientifically than it is done now. Few years ago, when we looked at the differing definitions of urbanization across states, we found that there are a set of 7 criteria which are being used by states in different combinations. Okay. But if you add the number of criteria being used by states, like, say population or, other definitions of demographics, etc., there were 7 such criteria being used in different combinations across states. But I don't believe there was that this was being revisited through an expert lens, through a slightly more scientific, systematic lens every 10 years, so as to take a fairly adaptive, well-informed decision on how do you absorb more areas into the urban fold, so to speak.
But so you're saying we don't necessarily need a national definition, but there needs to be a more scientific way to come up with definitions of urbanization, what constitutes urban, what constitutes urban poor, and we currently don't have those. Those are gaps that require.
See, the urban poor question is slightly different from what is urban.
Right.
Right. Because what is urban is is spatial in nature in some sense. Right. It'll also have other inputs. Demographics will play a role, socioeconomic characteristics may play a role, but it's essentially a spatial definition. And then that has implications and ramifications on how they will be governed. What laws will govern? Will they be rural laws or urban laws? But the definition of urban poor is a slightly different question. So my response was for the need for a national definition of urban. So what I said is, it's good to have national consensus on principles governing what is urban. It is not necessary that you have a national definition. It is okay for states to take a call on that, but states in turn should do that in a systematic, well-informed manner.
Right, that makes sense. So we've talked about migrant crisis briefly, so I'm just going to jump into like big questions about those. So it took us a pandemic to realize the plight of migrant workers, right? And there was media focus in it, while briefly, but there was attention. There was a lot of sort of public uproar about the crisis that happened. But now that we're in the wake of the pandemic, so to say, do you think the status and state of migrant workers would continue to be something that will hold public attention or policy focus? Is there also a lack of political will because migrants don't necessarily add to the vote bank in the cities they migrate to? So what would you think will happen now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my view, this is again linked to what I started off by saying. I think whether or not we will pay due care and attention to migrants in a city depends on whether we govern the city as a place, as a unit of governance. Because if we had originally governed the city as a place, the city would have a political head, the city would have an administrative head, and then different parts of the city would have political and executive heads. And if that was the case, then we would have identified this problem in a decentralized manner, and we would have been much quicker in responding to it, right? The reason this became a national crisis is because there is no government in the city. The city today is governed as silos, right? There is a government for water, there's a government for transport, there's a government for solid waste management, etc. Multiple agencies governing the city, and it's not really a place-based or a citizen-based view. If you had a government for the ward, and when I say government for the ward, I necessarily don't mean that there has to be a mayor for the ward, but what I mean is government is there in the ward to respond to the needs of the citizens. But today you don't have that. You don't have a ward office that is able to respond to needs of the citizens in a dynamic, adaptive way. And when I say respond, I don't necessarily mean resolve.
Right.
But if they're able to aggregate the voice of the citizen, if they're able to aggregate views and aspirations and desires and challenges and problems of citizens and send them up to the relevant parts of the government that deal with those challenges, and then give responses back to citizens, this problem would have been solved at source. I can tell you, even from the Bangalore experience, that in many neighborhoods of Bangalore, the government had no idea where migrants lived. It was neighborhood associations in that neighborhood who were adjoining migrant settlements that knew that, look, here is a settlement where there are migrant laborers, and therefore they were able to respond to their needs far quicker than the government.
Right. Okay, that's a great segue to my next question, because since you spoke about how these communities and neighborhoods were responding to the migrant situation, we know that Janaagraha aims at strengthening democracy and enabling development through community participation. How can citizenry nudge public administration? How does citizenry necessarily ensure that public administration works efficiently? Is also how fair is it to put, or how much of the onus can be put on citizens when it comes to effective public administration?
See, it is we believe that it takes two to tango in a democracy, and therefore citizens and governments have to work together constructively to transform quality of life. We also believe that citizenship is not just a means to better service delivery. But citizenship in a democracy is also an end in itself. Because you have views as a citizen, you have a voice as a citizen, and you therefore want agency and a role in civic governance in your neighborhood, right? So if you view this question, if you respond to this question from this perspective, then what naturally follows is that you need platforms for citizens to get together with governments to shape a neighborhood, to shape the future of a neighborhood, to collectively decide on resource allocation for the neighborhood, to collectively decide on priorities for that neighborhood in a democratic manner. So you need formal platforms like ward committees, as was envisaged in the 74th Constitution Amendment. Secondly, for these platforms to be functional meaningfully, you need codified processes on how those platforms would function in a very detailed manner to say, what will be the constitution of the ward committee? Who will compose the ward committee? And where will they meet? When will that meet? Who will decide the agenda, right? At what notice will the agenda be published? Where will you hold the meeting? What will be the quorum? And what are the consequences for issues that citizens raise in that meeting? And what is a follow-through process, closure, etc. So you need participatory processes to be defined in law. When I say law, it could be the rules as well, but by law. The third ingredient is really actionable information, right? To build trust. Why are we doing all of this? We're doing all of this to create a fabric of trust between citizens and governments at the neighborhood level, right? That is what strengthening of grassroots democracy really means. And if you have to do that, information is the lubricant of trust. You need to give actionable information that citizens are able to digest and interpret and use to arrive at their conclusions. And similarly, governments. When I say governments, includes both elected officials and last mile engineers and officers of the municipality. You need actionable information. So you're able to answer the so what question, right? Okay, so what? You spent 5 crores on fixing 20 street lights on Third Cross in this neighborhood. Are citizens feeling safer? Are those street lights functional? Were street lights your first priority? Right? So you need to be able to give actionable information on budgets, on plans, spatial plans, what level plans, what development plans, on contracts, once budgets are awarded, progress of work, etc., in a simple, easy to consume manner, including factoring in language options, how do you demystify this information, etc. And lastly, the fourth ingredient. So the first ingredient, formal platforms; second ingredient, participatory processes; third ingredient, actionable information; and lastly, communication. Right. Hyper local communication, and that is completely missing today. Right? That's completely missing. Where if I'm living in a certain neighborhood, I barely know what's going on in the neighborhood from a governance standpoint. Right. Which roads are getting asphalted? Right? Where is a public toilet getting built? Which contractor is working in my neighborhood? I have no information. Similarly, even during COVID-19, of course, during COVID-19, governments did try their best to communicate actively and so on. But the absence of these platforms and participatory processes and information, and the lack of recognizing the city as a place, and therefore having governance mechanism at a ward level and a sub-ward level, did throw up fissures in government's efforts. But even during COVID, that would have been extremely helpful and hugely impactful. When you need to deliver information on containment, on quarantine, on isolation, on testing, on tracing, on contact tracing, etc., the easiest way to do it is at a street level, right, neighborhood level, booth level, polling booth level, right? But for those to exist, you need communication channels, which in turn will depend on platforms and participatory processes and having distributed civic leadership of sorts, which these platforms will give rise to. And to the second part of your question on how fair is it to put onus, I wouldn't frame it in that manner. I would really say that this is a necessary, inevitable ingredient of a democracy. Neighborhood platforms for citizen participation are a necessary, inevitable constituent of a healthy democracy in the city. And it is a win-win-win for all stakeholders. And in some ways, I'd say it's inevitable. It's inevitable because if you want to figure out a way in which the upper middle class gated community and the neighboring slum community are in a phased manner able to meet their respective aspirations for basic quality of life and infrastructure, this can only happen if in that neighborhood they are all able to convene together in a platform. There are clear codified processes on how they will participate. So neither group, particularly the upper middle class group, is not able to capture resources. Thirdly, there is information that makes sure that if and when such a capture happens, that captures media attention, public attention, etc., and due process can take over. And lastly, there is communication that goes around, that circumscribes this entire activity, which ensures that if public toilets for girl children in slums is a requirement, and you also need manicuring of the lawn in the upper middle class park, right, a park in an upper middle class neighborhood, the prioritization of this can get taken care of in that neighborhood platform.
Right. That made a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I have a few follow-up questions, so I'm just going to club my last question with that. You spoke about having open communication, informing citizens, making information salient so that people's attention is drawn to it. Is this an administrative burden as well? Is that one of the reasons why it's not happening, or is it purely because there's lack of autonomy, and is it a financial burden? Is it an administrative burden? Would it add to that? That would be part one. Second is information and communication seems to be at the core of everything that you said. But how are these sophisticated sort of systems of information created that mobilize citizens? I think I'll end my question.
Yeah. So I won't really term it as a burden, because it is a requirement. And therefore, I wouldn't call it a burden. But does it require serious allocation of resources? The answer is yes, because you need people who are able to go out and engage with citizens at the neighborhood level. And we have a huge shortage in both number of people required to engage with citizens at the neighborhood level and also in skills and capabilities. Because it is non-trivial to engage with citizens. It can be cacophonic, it can be chaotic, it can be quite intimidating, because citizens, particularly in the Indian context, citizens will come with a litany of complaints, and many of those meetings could get aggressive, etc. Right? So we need to learn. It's a gradual process of maturing and learning how to function as a democracy, but we're not even attempting it right now at the last mile. So certainly it requires serious allocation of capital and training and number of skills and competencies, etc. The answer is surely a yes. To the second part of your question on information being at the core of it, see, I'll go back and say there are multiple things that need to fall in place. There has to be a policy framework which mandates these kind of platforms. The policy framework cannot just mandate the platform without codifying participatory processes. For the reasons that I called out just now, that participation is non-trivial. It is the exercise of democracy at the neighborhood level. It is non-trivial. The same kind of rules that exist when the Lok Sabha meets or when the Vidhan Sabha meets, and to a lesser extent when the Nagar Sabha meets, which is the city council, equally apply in principle to the Ward Sabha or the Ward committee. Where will you meet? How will you meet? Who will chair the meeting? All of that equally applies. And who gets to talk? How do you make sure that is fair? Who decides the agenda? Who captures the minutes? When does it get circulated? In which language? In which form? All of these things matter. What information gets placed? It is, after all, like a Lok Sabha for the neighborhood. So there are multiple elements. So there's a legal and policy element. There is the element of actionable information, and then there is communication, right? So all elements need to fall in place. How can this information get generated? And obviously, I'm talking about one side of this equation. There's another side of the equation, which is governance reforms, administrative reforms in governance. Do they have the required finances? Do they have the required staff? Do they have the required information technology backbone, etc.? So those are equally important. State capacity is equally important, right? So that's an important side of the equation as well. Otherwise, what tends to happen is you will have incredible pressure being put at the grassroots, but the government system is not able to respond to it adequately, right? So state capacities will have to be built up simultaneously, right? But it is this process is a self-correcting process. The mistake we often tend to make is we say, no, but we are not ready for it. You become ready through it. Swati and Ramesh, our co-founders, paraphrase Amartya Sen saying that countries don't become fit for democracy, but countries become fit through democracy. It's the same at the neighborhood level, right? This is a self-correcting mechanism, right? Because citizens and the local councillors will realize there is a huge state capacity problem. Then there is a demand placed continuously for greater resources. And then, democracy plays out between the ward committee and the city council and the state government and so on. There was one other question I missed responding to on to what extent migrants not having a vote influences political will to cater to their welfare. I think it's an important question, and I'll answer it in two parts. It's a yes and a no. It's yes for the reasons that you mentioned, that they are not part of the voting bloc. I'd also say it's a no because I'd like to believe this is not deliberate. I don't believe this is deliberate. I believe this is, somewhat systemic without being deliberate. But I do believe that this question has to be answered sooner or later. If everything is going to be tied, if rights of citizens are going to be tied to whether or not they are voters in a city, then what happens to migrants? Remember, migrants are both poor and migrants are also middle class and upper middle class, and they belong to all socioeconomic segments. And this phenomenon is going to rise over the next 20, 30 years. Indians are going to be moving around a lot. So 20 years ago, in the town that I grew up in a small town in Kerala, we would not find one person who speaks Hindi as mother tongue. Now there are schools which are dedicated only to students who speak in Hindi. That's the degree of migration that we are already beginning to see, right? In the deepest south of India. And you will see that happening all across as India urbanizes a lot more, and as, uh, a variety of factors influence migrations. So, but this is a tricky question, and we'll have to solve it sooner than later. No easy answers, because voting, whether you vote or not in a particular constituency, in a particular place, will naturally determine a lot of the rights and voice and agency. But at the same time, in a city, if you have a large number of migrants of all kinds, many of whom don't have voting rights in the city, then that does create challenges. So we'll have to find creative ways in which updation of voter rolls becomes much easier, and citizens who are migrants in certain cities but become natural residents of those cities are encouraged to give up their voter registration in their domicile, and they are able to vote in the city of their residence, etc.
Right. I made a okay, I did say that was my last question, but I do have a follow-up because this conversation is very interesting. So you spoke about governance at the ward level, and how is that just a decentralization issue that state governments are hogging the power, and if that's the only reason, how does one solve that? How does one do you see in the near future or in like the next decade, what governments having more power or local governance having more power?
Very hard to say. Very hard to say. That is the million-dollar question. The root causes are that, I'd say twofold. One is there is a problem that everybody wants power to be decentralized up to their own level and no further, right? So that problem does exist with respect to decentralization. The second aspect of this also is there is not adequate demand for it yet. Not many of us are getting together and asking for it. Third, I'd say, is that we are probably collectively not recognizing decentralization as a solution to many of the challenges that we are facing today. Right? In a democracy, you need a self-correcting mechanism where policy is able to deliver the last mile to citizens, is able to receive feedback back from citizens, and then that becomes like a virtuous cycle of you could say it's responsive governance, responsive adaptive governance, right? And that makes resource allocation much more efficient. That ensures accountability, builds trust between citizens and governments, etc. So it's also useful for the government. The government somehow is seeing decentralization as a pain, which in my view it is not, particularly in a condition where state capacities are so stretched. And you need to be very careful in allocating resources and people to particular tasks and activities. So it is a million-dollar question. It really depends on the government system comprising politicians and bureaucrats recognizing decentralization as a force for good, right, which benefits them, and about enough demand getting created in neighborhoods in our cities, demanding greater decentralization, with citizens also therefore recognizing that their broken footpaths and garbage and lack of sanitation, etc., is a cause of, is basically a fallout of lack of decentralized governance.
Right. Thank you, Srikanth. That was wonderful. I have gems like countries become fit through democracy, citizenship is an end in itself. So I think we have a lot.
Some of them are borrowed, and I've attributed them to where I heard them from. So, but it was a pleasure to be part of this conversation, Paavi, and all the best to all of you at the Indian School of Public Policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.